Good evening. I'm Senator Pat Roberts of Kansas. As the chairman of the Eisenhower Memorial Commission, it is my distinct honor to welcome you to this special event. We're calling it America's Reappreciation of Dwight D. Eisenhower. The commission originally scheduled this event to take place as an in-person event back in May. Now we're able to share this event with you in a virtual setting and make it accessible to an even larger audience. It has been nearly 60 years since President Eisenhower left office and 75 years since General Eisenhower oversaw the end of World War II. But it was not his status or his position that earned him the appreciation of a grateful nation. Instead, it was his sense of duty to his country. As a leader, Eisenhower was defined by his humility, his honesty, sincerity, optimism, and fortitude, and his belief in personal accountability. These were the qualities that set him apart, qualities that equipped him to make sound decisions in a setting where no one else could. These core qualities enabled Eisenhower to command a successful D-Day invasion, which became a pivotal turning point in the war. Ike worked hard to wage peace, regulate atomic power, and protect the world against the growing spread of communism. Without Ike, the trajectory of this country and the world might otherwise have been significantly altered, and not for the better. As a fellow Kansan, I believe that Ike's upbringing in Kansas played a strong role in making him the man he was. As Eisenhower himself once said, "The proudest thing I can claim is I am from Abilene." I want to thank you for taking the time to attend this special event. To introduce tonight's panel, here is the Executive Director of the Eisenhower Memorial Commission and my very good friend, General Carl Riddell.
Thank you, Senator Roberts. Good evening and welcome to all of you who are part of our webinar audience. And a special welcome to our distinguished panelists this evening, Lou Galambos, Will Hitchcock, and Yanek Mieczkowski, who will be guided by our esteemed moderator, Evan Thomas. As historians and authors of note, our panelists and moderators' biographies are fascinating in their own right, which is why we made them available on our website to you and to others who may be participating this evening. To have the fullest possible benefit of listening to our moderators and panelists discuss the fascinating subject of Eisenhower's evolving historical reappreciation, both as general and as president, my comments will be brief. Then, with Evan's direction, the panelists will examine and discuss the accelerating evolution in the ongoing reappreciation of Eisenhower's legacy, which will be followed by audience participation. From the perspective of having begun to work for the Commission in 2001 and subsequently serving as the Commission's Executive Director, I concluded that the Eisenhower Memorial itself is a special manifestation of the ongoing evolution and reappreciation of the Eisenhower legacy. In preparing to build the memorial, the Eisenhower Memorial Commission came to know and to believe that it was celebrating a world-class legacy requiring a world-class design. These conclusions inspired the Memorial Commission to secure a world-class memorial site at the base of the Capitol of the United States, and to follow that decision with the search for and the selection of a world-class architect, Frank Gehry. The resulting memorial reflects some of the special and particular contributions of the Eisenhower legacy to the great democratic experiment, the United States of America, of which we are all a part, and to which General and President Eisenhower was so passionately devoted and for which he sacrificed so selflessly. To help better understand the transformational Eisenhower legacy that inspired the Eisenhower Memorial, it is a privilege to present the panel moderator, Evan Thomas.
Thank you, Carl. Dwight Eisenhower's leadership in war and peace has stood the test of time. We have three experts here to tell you about it. Lou Galambos, the author of Eisenhower. Will Hitchcock, who's the author of The Age of Eisenhower. And Yanek Mieczkowski, the author of Eisenhower's Sputnik Moment. We're going to talk for about 45 minutes. Welcome, everybody. We're going to talk about 45 minutes between us, and then we're going to take questions from you. You can submit them through the chat function, through the question function on your screen. And after, at about 8 o'clock, I will start taking those questions, and we will answer them as well. So welcome, and let's start out. I thought we'd start out with Lou. Tell us about Eisenhower's great defining moment, a decision he had to make on June 6th, 1944.
Hi. It's no accident that we start with D-Day and the decision to launch the attack across the Channel on the German forces in France. It was a difficult decision. There was nasty weather, and the weather could have interrupted the invasion. Other things could have interrupted. There was a tremendously difficult decision to make about timing, and I had to make that. There was disagreement, and these were strong people who were making judgments about this. And Ike, at the end, smoking 4 packs of cigarettes a day, apparently, at this time in his life. I don't recommend that to anyone, but it was a tense and difficult time. And he made that call. And it's interesting to me because very few professionals have their entire life hinge on a particular decision. But I think in Eisenhower's case, his professional life was shaped and his political life certainly was tremendously influenced by this decision that he made, a successful decision to launch the attack. Now, what you may not know is that some of the internal disagreement was about strategy. And the Air Force and Air Force officers, strong, competent leaders, felt that they could bomb Germany into submission and that the attack might really not be necessary. And Ike had to fight that. For the only time in his career that I know of, and you may know of, and you can throw that in there, he said he would quit if he did not have the full support of strategic as well as tactical air forces. That's how close it was. Well, he got that. Churchill made certain that he got that. And it went on to be a painful, expensive, but successful attack and has established his place in history.
Thank you, Lou. We're going to talk. I'm going to ask Yanek now to tell us about another decision, more subtle thing in a way, but how he handled the Russian launch of Sputnik in 1957. Yanek, tell us about that.
Well, thanks, Evan. Sputnik was a huge event, not only in world history because it marked the start of the space age, but also for Eisenhower's presidency. It opened a window whereby critics really started to pummel Eisenhower, a popular president who had just the year before won a resounding re-election. But opposition politicians started to say after Sputnik that Eisenhower was asleep at the wheel, that he had allowed the Soviet Union to steal a real march on the U.S. and endanger national security in doing so. Even the military, Eisenhower's brethren, started to say that Eisenhower wasn't devoting enough resources and spending toward military and rockets. That was a charge that infuriated Eisenhower. He thought his forte as president was in national security. And then there was, and there still exists today, a myth of a Sputnik panic, that Americans allegedly were fearful of this object circling around in the heavens, that it could drop bombs on them. It wasn't really true. If you look at public opinion polls, and if you talk to people who perhaps remember Sputnik, they didn't feel panicked. But Eisenhower was afraid that the media was whipping up a frenzy and politicians were whipping up a frenzy that could lead to spending on projects, on missiles that really wasn't necessary for the country. So his response to Sputnik was very effective and measured. He swung into action. He gave 2 speeches on national TV to try to tout America's national security and progress in science. He appointed a science advisor to the president, the first ever, and he strengthened ties between the White House and the scientific community. He authorized a military rocket to launch America's first satellite, the Explorer, in January of 1958, just a few months after the Sputnik launch. And he also signed legislation that created NASA, which still directs America's space efforts. And it was very important to Eisenhower to create a civilian space agency because that emphasized a big difference between the US and the Soviet Union. America's space efforts, Eisenhower wanted to stress, were peaceful and civilian, directed by a civilian space agency. So that was paramount to Eisenhower to signing NASA and creating that kind of an agency. Eisenhower was not a space enthusiast. He wasn't a hardcore space cadet, but he did appreciate science and space, so much so that by the end of his presidency, Eisenhower had, to his credit, 31 satellites circling the Earth, whereas the Soviet Union just had 9. And those numbers are important, 31 to 9. It's a real scorecard to Eisenhower's credit. But behind the numbers, American satellites were also of much better quality. They were technologically much more efficient and superior to those of the Soviet Union. I'd say that the one area in space where Eisenhower made a misjudgment was in the interplay between space and national prestige. Eisenhower refused to recognize that space exploits, especially manned space exploits, landing men on the moon, for example, could enhance America's global standing. And that partly reflected his lack of training as a politician. It was left to John Kennedy in the next decade to propose sending men to the moon and reap the political harvest and global prestige from that effort.
You know, one thing that strikes me about his handling of Sputnik is that he didn't panic. Can you talk a little bit more about that, Yanek?
Sure. This goes back to his military training. He always said that the worst decisions are made in a panic. So Eisenhower's response to Sputnik was one of real calm. And critics misinterpreted that as being apathetic or not recognizing the danger posed by Sputnik. But Eisenhower wanted to respond to Sputnik in a very measured, incremental way. The last thing he wanted was a crash program, like a crash program for more ICBMs or more IRBMs. So he wanted to tamp down the media and the cries on Capitol Hill for lavish funding for space. He knew that there were lots of interests, lobbying interests in the military and among aeronautical corporations that could reap a real harvest from just garnering money and federal funding for their pet projects. And Eisenhower wanted to keep all of that at arm's length. There were proposals, for example, to create a Department of Science, a new cabinet-level Department of Science. Eisenhower thought that would just add another level to the bureaucracy. So he wanted also to just let the nation get a little breathing space and not create new agencies or new cabinet level departments that would be around forever.
Will, the civil rights movement started to bubble up in a real way in the administration of Dwight D. Eisenhower. Talk to us about how he dealt with the issue of civil rights.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's such an honor to be a part of this whole process, and I have such regard for Eisenhower, but also for the commission putting this whole program together. And I'm on the panel with 3 of my favorite historians, so this is just a treat. You know, when we think about Eisenhower and leadership, we naturally go to the war years, or we might go to national security, as we should. But I think it's also really important to remember what strides he made in the civil rights field, where as a leader, he took some risks. He was not in his comfort zone. He had to learn a field he didn't know well, that he wasn't really comfortable with. Those are all the things that great leaders can do. Crucial to remember to put Ike in context here. From the Civil War up through the 1950s, the United States was in the grip of what we call the Jim Crow era. Black Americans could not go to public schools. They could not serve in integrated units in the military. They could not, in some towns and localities, there were all kinds of chicanery so that they couldn't vote. The picture of civil rights in America on the eve of the Eisenhower presidency was not great. Eisenhower had grown up in a segregated military. He'd made his career in a segregated military. To the extent that he thought about it, he knew that segregation was wrong, but he wasn't a crusader on the issue. But he becomes president in 1953, and one of those things happens that shaped the rest of his presidency. A vacancy opened on the Supreme Court, and that vacancy was the Chief Justice. And Eisenhower chose Earl Warren, the quite moderate Republican governor of California, to take the role of Chief Justice. And within a very short period of time, Earl Warren, the Chief Justice, issues an opinion, Brown versus Board of Education, 1954, that overturns the segregation of public schools. Now, this is an extraordinary turning point in American history. And should Eisenhower get credit for it? Maybe, maybe not. He certainly should get credit for appointing Earl Warren. Now, a lot of people will say, you know, I heard that Ike didn't like Warren and that later he regretted it. And he said, gosh, that was the worst mistake I ever made. And my view on that is that's a caricature. It's true that Eisenhower later criticized Earl Warren and the Supreme Court for being a little too liberal on civil liberties, privacy rights, the Miranda rights, those came out of the Earl Warren court and so forth, free speech and so on. But he really didn't criticize him on civil rights. And I'll give you the piece of evidence for that. The 1957 decision by Eisenhower to send federal troops to the Little Rock, Arkansas high school to compel that state, whose governor was blocking integration, to compel state to allow 9 Black high school children to go to their local high school, Little Rock Central in Little Rock. And Eisenhower didn't have to make that decision. He was uncomfortable making it, but he knew the law of the land had been issued by the Supreme Court. It had to be respected, and he would do everything he could to uphold the law of the land. That tells us a lot about his character, about what he thought the presidency was about. And I think it shows how much he learned as president.
Let's talk a little bit about the formation of that character. Let's, Lou, take it back to Kansas, to the young Eisenhower out there in the prairie, child of a poor family, but a very faithful family. And take us up through Kansas and take us to West Point and tell us what he learned at the U.S. Military Academy.
The senator has already touched upon this, that Eisenhower had deep roots in that part of what I can still consider the Middle West. And they were important, and he acknowledged them during his life. When you start to look at this and you look at his early career, which fascinated me when I started working on my book, and took me back to a period before what we were working on the papers. So what you find is you find 2 kinds of values. Those values that he acquired in Kansas and Abilene, and those values that he rejected. And when you reject values, you acknowledge their importance. And he acknowledged that later in his life. But he turned away from a number of things that were important to his family and important in Abilene. But let's look first at some of the things he accepted and how that affected his life. He was, you know, I'm originally from the Midwest, and we talked about people who are down home. When you were down home, you fitted in. Your values fitted in with those of the Middle West. And Eisenhower was certainly down home in that sense. When he was a young man, particularly in high school, not in upper school, but high school, his probably three things he was most interested in were football, girls, and baseball, in that order of importance. Now, his mother made certain that he did a lot of work in school, but and I did work in school and did well in school, but his real intention was someplace else, and he loved those things and loved sports in a way that's very common in the Midwest. He also learned over time to enjoy hard work. I worked in the creamery where his father had a job, and earned almost as much money as his father did. And he worked hard and long hours, and he learned how to work hard. He also learned how to love the outdoors. Now that stood him in good stead when he was in the Army, and also particularly at West Point, where they had a lot of programs that took you out on what was called bivouac. And so that stayed with Eisenhower for a long time. Now, there were things that he turned against in terms of the family and of the Midwest. He was not a pacifist, as his mother and father were. He rejected that. He was not a socialist. His father ran for office once on a socialist platform. He was not. Personally, in his personal life, he began to smoke cigarettes. I mentioned already the 4 packs a day, but he began that habit very early in his life when he left Abilene. And he also began to drink moderately, but with some enjoyment. And that too, his family was opposed to. So some of those great traditions from the family, he also was not religious in the same sense that his family was. His mother was deeply religious and devoted to the Bible and Bible studies. His father was what I would call a seeker. His father kept looking in new places for meaning in life and meaning above the sort of affairs of everyday life. And Ike was not like that at all. He had some religious values, indeed, but it was not a subject of great importance to Ike. And later, as a politician, he did the perfunctory things that you're supposed to, but he was not religious in the same sense that his family was. So he both rejected things and accepted things. The one thing that he had trouble with when he went to West Point, and I want to get to West Point, when he got to West Point, he had trouble with authority. Now, when I look at college professors, I always say, well, they either have authority up or they have authority down, but they seldom are good at both. And Eisenhower had a lot of trouble with authority above him. If he's a college professor, it would have been the dean or the provost or the president. But he never had any trouble with authority below him. The men loved him. When he coached, they loved him. When he was later an officer in the Army, his men loved him. So he came out of there with he had to make a lot of adjustments, and that's his mentor, General Fox Connor, was the one who helped him deal with authority above him. And he learned how to do it extremely well, as he learned many other things.
Will, interestingly, General Eisenhower did not see combat in World War I. Talk to us about that and the effect of that and how he dealt with that long, hard period between the wars.
Yeah, it's a great story. And Lou, I'll just say that all the college professors I know have trouble with authority also. So there you go. You know, it's quite an amazing story. Eisenhower, at the arc of his career, he leaves West Point in 1915, and the world is at war. So you got to figure, I'm going to get into this thing. I'm going to get my shot. America enters World War I, 1917. That's going to be his big moment. But Eisenhower's talents as a leader have already been identified by the Army. And instead of sending him into combat, he's sent to train other officer candidates. So he kicks around during the last year of the war, in commands in Georgia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, elsewhere. But the war comes to an end without him getting into combat. He's a 28-year-old major in a sudden war in a country that isn't at war anymore, and that's going to start pulling its military apart. So that was a big disappointment for him, I think, and I know that he felt it would be impossible to overcome that. I just want to say on a note about his personal biography, the immediate post-World War I years were difficult in another way. Not only was he disappointed in his not getting a shot at the war, but in Eisenhower's personal life, it was a hard time. He and Mamie lost their first child, Dwight, who died of scarlet fever in January 1921 at the age of 3, a terrible blow to this young couple that they, in some respects, never overcame. But Eisenhower found a way to move up, and Lou's right. He learned how to work. He learned how to take authority. He learned how to work within the structure of the Army. And I'll say that the key to his success was that he found powerful patrons to help him. And that's not a bad thing. When you're young, you need help, and you've got to latch on to powerful people and serve them, make them look good. And he did this again and again. Lou has mentioned General Fox Connor, who took Eisenhower to Panama, where they spent 2 years there in the Panama Canal Zone. Connor gave him this kind of graduate school, gave him books on history and strategy, and they talked late into the night about Clausewitz and Thucydides. Eisenhower's mind was a sponge. He learned, he read, he was fascinated by all this stuff. Later, he would be noticed by none other than the chief of the staff of the Army, General Douglas MacArthur, who would also say, hey, I want that smart young guy on my staff. I want him to make me look good. In 1931, he starts working for MacArthur. You can't imagine two people more different. The vainglorious, operatic MacArthur and the humble and relatively affable Eisenhower. But Ike knew what his job was, which was to make the boss look good, and he did it so well that MacArthur said when he went to 1935, he goes to the Philippines, he brings Eisenhower with him. Another 4 years of working for MacArthur. So Ike worked in the shadows of famous men of the interwar period for a long time, building a reputation as a great officer, great staff officer, dedicated, loyal, someone that you want on your staff. Well, sure enough, just after December 1941, when George Marshall, now the chief of staff of the Army, is putting together the brain trust, the dream team in the war plans division, he knows about Eisenhower. He's heard about him. He's seen his record, and he brings him onto his staff, calls him and says, come to Washington. I don't need warriors. We're going to take care of the soldiers. We've got those guys. I need men who are going to help us build the infrastructure for a new kind of war, a total war, a world war. And I need people like Eisenhower. So it's a great story. And he had help to get up to the top.
We talked a little bit about D-Day. Lou talked about D-Day. But Yanek, talk to us a little bit about Eisenhower as the supreme Allied commander in World War II, and what that really meant and what qualities that called upon.
Well, one of the greatest qualities that comes to mind, Evan, is Eisenhower as a diplomatic general or a diplomat general. He helped everybody smooth over differences and got everybody to work together. For the U.S. military, that meant melding the Army and the Navy and the Marines and smoothing over the inter-service rivalries for which the services were notorious. And for the Allies, that meant coordinating strategy among political leaders like Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, and generals, sometimes very difficult generals like Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery of Britain and General George Patton of the U.S. Bernard Montgomery, for example, was often really difficult with Eisenhower, even once calling Eisenhower's plans rubbish. But Eisenhower tolerated that kind of behavior because, as he once said, if I can keep the team together, then everything is worth it. One theme of Eisenhower's presidency, one metaphor for Eisenhower that I often repair to is the notion of balance. Eisenhower represented balance. He mentioned that word often. He used that term 9 times in his farewell address. And Eisenhower was a Midwesterner, and he thought of his politics as the middle way. And with regard to World War II, he was sort of the balance point, a fulcrum point between the military and civilian worlds. And he made it look easy, although it was very difficult. The two worlds clashed a lot. For example, the military initially did not like Franklin Roosevelt's Europe First strategy in World War II. So Eisenhower's strength was in composing the differences between the military and civilian worlds, acting as a balance point between the two. I would add that another one of Eisenhower's strengths as a diplomat general was how he stressed the alliance over national loyalties. British soldiers, for example, resented American GIs often. They complained that American GIs in Britain were oversexed, overpaid, and over here. To which American GIs, of course, retorted, well, you guys are undersexed, underpaid, and under Eisenhower. But there was one incident where a American GI apparently cursed out a British soldier, calling him an SOB, and Eisenhower actually remanded that soldier to the US. He wanted him out of Great Britain. And the British soldier actually appealed to Eisenhower, asking Eisenhower to show a little leniency. And Eisenhower's response was, I understand that he called you a British SOB. That's something quite different. So what Eisenhower was stressing there was that national loyalties should be subsumed to the alliance. The alliance was all important. And that again showed Eisenhower's skill as a diplomat general. That really helped him work effectively as Supreme Allied Commander during World War II.
Of course, World War II is not the end of Ike's duty, military duty by any means. So Lou, talk to us a little bit about Ike after World War II. He's Army Chief of Staff, and he's got a big job. Talk to us about that.
Well, he believed in unity, and you're right, Yanek, he believed in balance, and he believed in kind of what I would call a middle way guidance for all of our political and economic organizations, and that was hard to do. Service rivalry was intense. The services were a political force unto themselves. So the Navy, for instance, was extremely good at lobbying. And Ike hated this because they were running up to the Hill and getting things passed and getting political support. And he resented that and felt that they were not working together. Now, you've got to remember that in the immediate post-war period, the United States did not have a settled strategy for dealing with the threat of the exercise of force by the USSR. The services could not agree on what a strategy would be. And we were left sitting without an agreed upon strategy at that point. So the disunity that came out of that was tremendously provoking to Eisenhower. And if you want to find the roots of what he said in that final address about the military-industrial complex, go back to the Chief of Staff period when he had to deal with this. So he saw that as a threat to our nation, a threat to the world and world peace. And he was very, very upset with it.
Of course, Eisenhower had to be a great politician within the military, but he had political skills more broadly speaking. They showed themselves all through his career, but along about, well, actually, before 1950, people are talking about him as a potential president, including President Truman. Will, talk to us about Eisenhower, the politician.
Oh, it's so interesting that he makes this shift, right? He could have retired after being chief of staff, and he would have been considered one of the great commanders of American history, hands down. He didn't need to be president to have his place in history secure. So it's a little bit of also, why did he do it? Why did he go into politics, and what was he like as a politician? I'll just say, you know, the thing that surprised me on working on Eisenhower was that I knew that he had governed as a moderate. But in 1948 to 51, 52, he's still trying to figure what kind of a politician he wants to be or what kind of his political values were. And the thing that comes out really clearly is that Eisenhower was a conservative. And he thought of himself as a conservative. He did not like big government. He was very critical in private and then later in public of the New Deal and of the expenses of the enormous expenses of the war years, but then also the Truman Fair Deal. He felt that government had gotten too big and that it was in jeopardy of smothering individual initiative, freedom, and liberty of Americans. Now, whether that was true or not, that's what he believed. And he was afraid that America was just becoming like those big totalitarian countries that America had just fought in the war. Well, this was the environment that he was operating in. And he had many friends in business and in the private sector who said, Eisenhower, you are the only man who can save us from socialism. And, I don't know if that was what tipped the balance, but it was a factor. And I think Harry Truman's own presidency, we think of Harry Truman very fondly nowadays, but he had a pretty rough go of it towards the end of his presidency. He was unpopular, the economy was bad, the Korean War was going on. And so the country was looking for a change of parties. It had been 20 years that the Democrats had been in the White House. So everything aligned perfectly for a new face, a fresh face. And Eisenhower was the most popular man in America, hands down, throughout the whole decade of the 50s. So when they started running, Evan, as you say, they started running those polls in 1948, 49, 50, they would, a hypothetical matchup of Truman versus Eisenhower. Ike would come out 3 points ahead every time. So he knew there was something there. He knew the country was looking to him. And I think he finally was drawn into it. I just want to say one last thing, though. In the campaign of 1952, it was pretty bitter and pretty ugly. And I'm not sure it was Eisenhower's finest moment. I think he had a brilliant presidency, but that election was not his finest moment. This was peak McCarthyism and the Red Scare, and Joe McCarthy was himself running for re-election. He was a popular figure in Wisconsin, even elsewhere in the country. Eisenhower campaigned with McCarthy. He didn't confront McCarthy when McCarthy had said bad things, horrible things about George Marshall, Eisenhower's mentor. And I think that he showed that he was a rookie in politics in that 1952 election. Once he became president, of course, he did a great deal to undermine McCarthy, but the 52 election was a little bit of a something of a black mark in many ways.
On the undermining of
can I add one thing to that?
Yes, please.
On the politics and on the switch in his career, what you have to add is that the man had intense ambition. He had he was ambitious, and he had been told since 1943 that he could probably be president of the United States. And so I don't see him as wavering as much as most people do. I see him worrying about maybe losing. He hated the thought of running and losing, but he was a very ambitious man.
I want to go back to McCarthy for just 1 second. He does not distinguish himself, as Will said, in the 52 election, not standing up for his old buddy, General Marshall. But after he's elected, he does take steps to undermine McCarthy. We'll talk a little bit more about that, the sort of subtle political skills, if you agree with that.
Yeah.
That Eisenhower turned on McCarthy.
Well, Eisenhower's view, right or wrong, it was his view, and he was the president, was that he could not be seen to be tangling with a kind of maverick bully in his own party, the Republican Party, like Joe McCarthy. It couldn't become McCarthy versus Eisenhower. Privately, he said again and again, I don't want to get in a gutter with that skunk. I dislike him. I hate what he's doing. But how are we going to deal with it? Many of his friends wrote to him anguished letters saying, Ike, stand up, take a stand, say something publicly about it. He said, I can't do that, but I'm going to try, see what I can do. And what he was really doing was giving McCarthy, Joe McCarthy, the rope he needed to hang himself. And once McCarthy got into those Army McCarthy hearings, I mean, he did so much damage to himself. And in the process, he created a paper trail, McCarthy did, in which he had broken every norm, every rule, every form of decency. And so an enormous paper trail was accumulated about how McCarthy had intimidated, bullied witnesses and berated the army. Well, Eisenhower and his staff carefully accumulated this data and leaked it to the press, which embarrassed McCarthy and put him on his back heels. So they did the Washington thing. They did it behind closed doors, underneath the table, and it wasn't pretty. And many people didn't know Ike was involved in it, and so he couldn't take credit for helping bring Joe McCarthy down. But he did help to bring him down, and it's one of those things Ike historians debate a lot about, whether he should get credit for it.
Yanek, another controversial area for President Eisenhower was covert operations, Ike and the CIA. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, sure, Evan. That was one of the darker, more Machiavellian sides to Eisenhower's policy, his use of covert ops to implement U.S. foreign policy. And to understand why Eisenhower resorted to these techniques, I think we have to put everything in the Cold War context. I mean, the U.S. was fighting the Cold War at the time. This was essentially the third major war in Eisenhower's lifetime. And after World War I and World War II, Eisenhower knew the U.S. had to win this Cold War as well. But it involved a different strategy and tactics. This wasn't a hot shooting war, and a nuclear war was unthinkable. Eisenhower wanted to avoid another conventional war, and so his options were relatively limited, and that left covert operations as one viable option. There were other reasons why covert ops appealed to Eisenhower. One was the growth of third world nations during his presidency. In his presidency, about 24 colonies became nations, and they didn't align themselves immediately with the first world, the free world, or the second world, the communist world. These were third world nations, underdeveloped and unaligned, and Eisenhower wanted to avoid letting them move into the Soviet orbit. He wanted to try, if anything, to align them with the US by installing pro-American leaders. And then there was yet another reason why covert ops appealed to Eisenhower, and that was fiscal. I mean, it was carrying out foreign policy on a thin dime, which was a theme of Eisenhower's presidency. He wanted to implement foreign policy and strengthen national security without bankrupting the country. And two of the best examples of Eisenhower and covert ops were in Iran and Guatemala. In Iran, of course, a third world country with oil resources, a strategic position near the Persian Gulf. But it had a leader, Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, old Mossi, who was leaning toward communism. And so Eisenhower and his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, his CIA Director, Allen Dulles, the Dulles brothers, engineered a coup in Iran. They used a CIA agent, Kermit Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt's grandson, to instigate a coup d'etat and install a pro-American Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the Shah of Iran, and eject Mossadegh. And in Guatemala, something similar the next year in 1954, getting installed Castillo Armas, a pro-American leader. In both cases, though, you got the result of repressive regimes that did not help the social or economic condition of the people there, and they reaped bitter fruit for the U.S. over the years. Iran was a purely pungent example of that. The Shah, although a very good and reliable U.S. ally in the Middle East for the next few decades, was extremely unpopular and repressive in Iran. He had a personal police force, the Savak, that terrorized the Iranian people. And that all came back to bite him in 1979 when there was a popular revolution. The Ayatollah Khomeini came back and was installed as the leader of Iran. And once the U.S. admitted the former Shah of Iran to this country for medical treatment, that was when Iranians stormed the U.S. embassy, took 52 American hostages, held them for 444 days, and crippled the presidency of Jimmy Carter. So covert ops for Eisenhower seemed successful at the time. They seemed to help realign the third world toward the U.S., but over the long term, they reaped a bitter harvest and created a lot of animus toward the U.S. among these third world nations.
On a happier note, the gross national product, the GDP in the United States, increased by about 60% during Ike's time, I believe. Lou, tell us a little bit about how Ike did that.
First, I want to say that Yanek made a very important point, and it's important to understand Ike to remember that the world was moving toward socialism and toward communism and not toward democratic capitalism. The two largest countries in the world had just moved in that direction, away, that is to the left. So it's very important to understand Eisenhower at that point in history. Now, the other aspect of that point in history was that the economists of the world had been converted right before that to Keynesian economics. That conversion process took place really during the Second World War, and it brought a new attitude toward debt, particularly government debt, and toward what the government should do in order to keep the economy growing. There was dread fear, remember, in the 40s and 50s of sagging back into the Great Depression. And Eisenhower had to deal with that. Now, he was relatively conservative about political economy. He tried to learn as much as he could and was willing to implement some policies consistent with a Keynesian analysis, but he was dreadfully afraid of inflation. Now, why? Why would he be so afraid of inflation? Well, he was thinking about people on relatively fixed incomes. And these were people he knew in Abilene. These were people who were not going to make a great deal of money if we had a new industry that was going to push the economy ahead. These people were locked in, and he was very worried about the effects of the economy on those people. And so he was a man who prioritized always. And he thought that our economy, the first thing was national security, and the second thing was economic security for Americans over the long term. And over the long term, he felt that we should avoid inflation and encourage growth. So he took the middle way in economic terms and tried as hard as he could and successfully 3 times to balance the budget. It's hard to think today about a balanced budget, actually, but he got one 3 times. He did get the growth that you mentioned. He also got growth that favored women in the economy and favored those people that he was thinking about in working class America and the middle class. And the middle class was thriving in those years.
Ike is president at a time when you have this incredible face-off between East and West, between capitalism and communism, democracy and communism. And the atom bomb hangs over all this. We are in a nuclear age. Talk to us about Ike and national security and Ike's foreign policy and how he handled these unbelievable challenges.
Well, Eisenhower developed a new defense policy called the New Look, and that involved relying on nuclear weapons and the threat of massive retaliation. The Korean War, one of the lessons that it delivered for Eisenhower was that conventional wars could result in frustrating stalemate and setbacks and just enormous body counts with little progress. So Eisenhower and Secretary of State John Foster Dulles fashioned a new defense policy that practiced brinkmanship, taking your opponent, in this case communist countries, to the brink of nuclear war, threatening to use nuclear weapons, the atomic bomb, wringing concessions out of them. In essence, it was a game of nuclear chicken. It was quite a way to conduct foreign policy, threatening nuclear war. But again, one of the reasons for Eisenhower repairing to this strategy was economic. It was fiscal. Nuclear weapons, atomic weapons, were much cheaper than maintaining conventional forces, troops, and all the weapons and material you needed to support troops. With atomic weapons, you get more bang for the buck, or as the expression of the time also went, you get more rubble for the ruble. So in order to make that threat, though, of using atomic weapons credible, believable. Eisenhower approved the development of very small nuclear weapons, like the Davy Crockett. It was called the Davy Crockett atomic bomb that could basically fit inside a knapsack. And Eisenhower once said, "I don't see why you can't use atomic bombs just like a bullet on the battlefield." So that was his thinking, to reduce the size of atomic weapons to a small scale and have this array of atomic weapons from small to large that you could threaten communist opponents with. That was one facet of Eisenhower's defense policy. Another was completing the triad. You already had bombers with atomic bombs, to which Eisenhower added intercontinental ballistic missiles and submarine launched ballistic missiles. And this was a very effective array of strategic deterrence that lasted for the rest of the Cold War. The ICBM race was what really mattered to Eisenhower, much more so than with the space race. And so he approved the Atlas and the Titan ICBMs. He also, and they were functional by the end of his presidency. He also approved the Minuteman ICBM, a very advanced ICBM that relied on solid fuel as opposed to liquid fuel that had fueling problems before being deployed. And then the Polaris submarine-launched ballistic missile was a quantum leap in technology because it was undetectable. In fact, when Eisenhower briefed President-elect Kennedy after Kennedy won the 1960 election, when Eisenhower briefed Kennedy on national security, he mentioned the Polaris and he told Kennedy, "This is invulnerable. It's invulnerable." So these national security elements actually helped Kennedy during his presidency in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Kennedy ironically had charged that there was a missile gap between the US and the Soviet Union. There was, except it was highly in favor of the United States. And so when Kennedy was president and was facing off against the Soviet Union in the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was the U-2 spy plane that detected missiles in Cuba. And it was really the preponderance of America's lead in ICBMs and SLBMs that really forced the Soviet Union to back down. And Kennedy benefited from these elements. These elements were all put in place by Dwight D. Eisenhower.
Of course, the U-2 got shot down at the end of what? Tell us about that crisis. It was a moral crisis for Dwight Eisenhower because he got caught in a lie, which is very unusual for him, necessary perhaps, but talk to us about the U-2 crisis and what that meant at the end of his second term.
Yeah, the U-2 spy plane was a very effective device for monitoring the Soviet Union, a closed society that had rejected Eisenhower's open skies proposal at Geneva. And so the U-2 was an incredibly advanced airplane. It could fly at 70,000 feet. A U-2, Eisenhower very unwisely approved a U-2, one final U-2 flight before the planned summit in Paris with Nikita Khrushchev in May 1960. And the Soviet Union shot down that spy plane. And Khrushchev laid a trap for Eisenhower in which he slowly trickled out information on exactly what the Soviet Union had. So at first, Eisenhower approved a cover story that it was a NASA weather plane where the pilot had lost consciousness and accidentally drifted into Soviet airspace. And then Khrushchev revealed we have the wreckage, and then we have the pilot who's alive. It was very embarrassing for Eisenhower. He refused to apologize, though, for this because he was protecting national security. He got to the Paris summit with Khrushchev. Khrushchev refused even to shake his hand, so the summit collapsed before it began. And it ended Eisenhower's presidency on a sour note. He had really hoped to end his presidency with a visit to the Soviet Union later that year, and Khrushchev ended up retracting that invitation. He had hoped to achieve an arms control agreement with the Soviet Union. That collapsed as a result of the U-2 incident. And Eisenhower referred to that stupid U-2 mess. He really regretted it, and it caused a sour note on which his presidency ended. Ann Whitten, his secretary, even thought that she heard Eisenhower crying over it once. And it was a one time where Americans saw this grandfatherly, trustworthy figure, Eisenhower, trapped in a lie. And people started to joke that the CIA, the U-2 was a CIA plane, stood for caught in the act. And this was a moment where the credibility gap started to open, and Americans realized that their government wasn't always trustworthy and wasn't always honest. So it was an unfortunate turning point in Eisenhower's presidency and in American history overall.
In 1956, there was a happier demonstration of Eisenhower's leadership. An amazing series of events right around Ike's reelection, actually, in 1956. And Will, talk to us about that amazing time in November 1956 and how Ike handled two crises at once.
Yeah, it's an amazing story, and it goes well with what Yanek just said. I mean, the 1960 crisis was Eisenhower's lowest moment, I think, absolutely. But I think possibly, at least in foreign affairs, maybe the best 10 days came in 1956. And in a way, it was by acting to demonstrate restraint rather than war. And it ran, the decisions that he made ran against the emotional instincts that you might have had. Now, I'm talking about two twin crises that unfolded in the same very narrow window of period. Fall of 1956, Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal, which was owned and operated by the British and the French, and the British and French were angry about this, and they wanted to take it back. And so they came up with a scheme in which they would ask Israel to invade Egypt, and then the British and the French would intervene in that conflict as peacekeepers, and then in the meantime, they would re-seize the canal and overthrow this upstart Egyptian president, Nasser. Well, it was a crazy scheme to begin with, but what made it especially loopy was that the British and the French and the Israelis tried to keep the United States out of it. They didn't tell Eisenhower. In fact, Eisenhower knew something was up, and he said again and again to Prime Minister Eden, we're not going to use any force now. We're going to negotiate our way out of this, because Eisenhower was worried that the whole Arab world would be inflamed and would turn against the United States. The colonial powers used force in Egypt. He also feared the possibility of a Soviet response that might lead to war. Well, they went ahead with the scheme. They did invade Egypt. The whole thing was a fiasco. And Eisenhower used a great deal of financial pressure to compel the British and the French to withdraw from their invasion while it was just halfway, it was only about halfway started. So the British lost a great deal of face, and Eisenhower used his pressure to pull out his allies from an invasion they thought was important. He ran again, he turned his back on his friends, you could say, or you could say that he really did what was right in the national interests of the country as well as of keeping stability in the Cold War. And what makes it extraordinary is at the very same moment, the Soviet Union had invaded Hungary. And there was a democratic uprising against communism and Soviet rule in Hungary in the fall of 1956. Soviets rolled in tanks in November and suppressed that riot and killed maybe 2,000 people in the streets of Budapest. Eisenhower did nothing. And to this day, I often get questions. Why did Eisenhower not help the Hungarians? But Eisenhower's view was, are you kidding? This is a tiny little country in the Soviet sphere. They had no right to challenge Soviet power. They took risk, and they shouldn't have done. It's not America's responsibility to bail out every small country that is suffering, because if we do, we're likely to trigger a third world war. Now, that's a pretty cold-blooded calculus, but I believe that's the calculus that leaders have to make. He had to restrain American power. He had to suppress his emotional attachments and think about the long-term Cold War struggle with the Soviet Union. And imagine doing all that while you're running for re-election. You know, he did in November 56, he's running for re-election. He gave a couple of speeches. He never let that election take his eye away from the much graver crises of the Cold War. And I think that speaks volumes about how he believed the national interest was far more important than politics or his re-election.
You know, when Ike left office in 1961, he didn't rate that high. They would do these polls of scholars, and the Eisenhower presidency was sort of middling. But today, when they ask scholars or historians about Eisenhower, he's way up there. He's, I think, the most recent one, number 5, right after, you know, I think Washington, Lincoln, I forget who number 3 is. And, you know, Eisenhower is up. What happened? Just, Lou, why don't you start us out? How did Eisenhower's stature go from something that was kind of middle of the road right after he left the White House to today where he is so highly, highly ranked?
Well, for one thing, the ideology associated with elections, which becomes very intense, has now disappeared. That no longer arouses people. That is the language and the sides that were set. All of that drops away. We begin to think about things such as the basic strategy of the United States, which has stayed the same as it was under Eisenhower. It is still the new look strategy. The other factor that's very important is we've had a lot of other presidents since then. And so we have a lot to compare Eisenhower with in dealing with these kinds of national problems. The third factor that I would place there is that good historical research has been done. And we know an awful lot more about decision-making at that time. And so I think that's helped. For instance, the Eisenhower-Dulles relationship. In the 1950s, Dulles was out front where Eisenhower wanted him and making big headlines. Well, what we know from historical research is there wasn't a single decision that Dulles made that wasn't vetted by Eisenhower, that wasn't approved by him and wasn't consistent with his strategy. So we know those things now, and it helps us understand his leadership.
Yanek, what do you think?
Well, Eisenhower was handicapped by some of his priorities. Presidents who have grand programs with sweeping names like the New Deal, the Fair Deal, the Great Society, tend to attract a lot more historical attention and more charitable interpretations by historians themselves. And Eisenhower's forte was fiscal conservatism. He actually wanted to do the opposite. He wanted to hold down federal spending and achievements budgets. And that doesn't attract a lot of excitement in the historical profession. It's boring, it's dull. And yet Eisenhower was somebody who got into the nitty gritty of looking at budgets and vetoing bills. He vetoed 181 bills as president. And part of that was just to hold down federal spending. And that doesn't attract a lot of historical attention. But now we see those three balanced budgets as almost a miracle work by Eisenhower. It really seems a significant accomplishment in the rearview mirror of history. And that the prosperity of the Eisenhower years, the peace, prosperity, and progress, the three P's of presidential achievement, loomed much larger in the rearview mirror, especially when you compare it to what came afterward, the Vietnam War in the 1960s and domestic disorder, and then the inflation of the 1970s. Lou mentioned how vigilant Eisenhower was about inflation. Well, we really got high inflation in the 1970s, and it became clear to historians and others that it was no accident that Eisenhower avoided that. It was a deliberate, cautious, and moderate approach as president, where he held down federal spending, even at the risk of 3 mild recessions during his presidency. They were years of low inflation, low unemployment. They were good years, and in the rearview mirror, they started to look a lot better.
Well, Fred Greenstein, a president, wrote about the hidden hand of Dwight Eisenhower that started some of this scholarship that Lou mentioned. What do you think about that thesis of the hidden hand? And is that why we sort of didn't realize how great a president he was until much later?
Well, I'll give Fred Greenstein this. He has the best title of any book in the Eisenhower bibliography, because in that title is a whole thesis. But Eisenhower hid his power and his stealth and his drive, his ambition. And he really was referring to how he handled McCarthy, but really, in general, it was a way of trying to tell us that Ike was a master politician, appearing in public in one way, but behind the scenes being a real genius. What I found is that Eisenhower never tried to hide his power or his authority. I found that he wanted to demonstrate that he was in command and that he was skilled and that he resented the accusations that he was dumb or played a lot of golf or somehow wasn't paying attention. He made himself available to the press every week in pretty tough press conferences, one-on-one. He wasn't afraid of being out in public and being seen to steer the country. But I just want to come back, Evan, if you don't mind, to why Ike is rising in the polls. I think one reason, to put it simply, is that some other presidents are starting to slip, and that's made room for Ike. So there's two guys who used to perennially be among the top list, and that's Andrew Jackson and Woodrow Wilson. And for reasons in part having to do with race and racial politics, those two presidents are now seen in a bit less favorable light. Whether that's fair or not, we could argue, but that's probably one factor. Another factor is that these presidential polls used to just be popularity contests. Hey, who do you like? But now what they ask is, what are the factors that make for a good president? And so they ask you, well, how did he do on the economy? How did they do on national security? How did they do on moral issues or personal integrity? How did they do on popularity ratings while they were in office? And if you add up these categories, the amazing thing about Eisenhower is that he's very, very strong in all of these categories. And so people are beginning to realize that he was the sort of, he could kind of do it all. He hit all of the sweet spots of American politics. And then the last thing I would just say about why Ike is so appealing to us now and why this memorial is so important and why I think it's going to really resonate in America is because most of his successors remain polarizing figures. You either love them or you don't like them. And that's just because our politics is more polarized. But the reality is that overwhelmingly in American public life today, if people know much about Eisenhower, they have positive associations with his style, with his leadership, with his selfless service in the Second World War, with his optimism, with his sense of really inhabiting the American character. And maybe that's a little touch of mythology layered onto a political career, but I think that has a lot to say with why people appreciate his style, his political gifts, his memory, his presence. And I really think it's going to make the Eisenhower Memorial an astonishing success because it really resonates with what America thinks about its own best character. Its own best self in some ways was displayed by Dwight Eisenhower.
I absolutely agree with America's best self, but I'm reminded that no less an authority than Richard Nixon once said about Eisenhower, he was a great guy and all that, but he's more devious than most Americans realize. Now, was that Nixon projecting, or would you say that, let's stick with you here, would you say that Ike was devious?
I wouldn't say he was devious, but I would say he was devious to Nixon. Which is to say that, he didn't want Nixon to stay on the ticket in 1956, and he tried to signal that he didn't want him. He thought Nixon would take himself off ticket, and he didn't. And so Eisenhower they shadow boxed over this, and the relationship between Nixon and Eisenhower is fascinating. There's a wonderful book on that topic. But I think that Nixon never understood Eisenhower's extraordinary gifts, his political success, his popularity, and he envied him, frankly. And although Nixon would, of course, become president, I often think that he never quite got out from the shadow of Dwight Eisenhower. And that may be partly to explain why he thought of Ike as devious.
One thing that we didn't touch on, briefly we touched on it, was the famous Eisenhower farewell address, which he talked about the military-industrial complex. I think people are still scratching their head a little bit about that when here Ike, the great general, and the guy who created our massive nuclear arsenal, could be talking about the military industrial complex. Yanek, why don't you tell us a little bit about Ike's farewell and what you think he was really trying to tell us?
Well, Eisenhower really admired George Washington. Washington was really one of Eisenhower's great idols. And of course, Washington imparted to Americans this warning about foreign alliances. And so Eisenhower approached Malcolm Moose about a year before he was about to leave office and suggested to Moose that he start thinking about a farewell address in which he could also impart a warning to Americans. And Moose might very well have been the person who came up with the phrase military-industrial complex, or some variants. There's some speculation that originally the phrase was military-industrial congressional complex, because there was a conglomeration of all these groups that were fighting to increase federal funding. But Eisenhower was really afraid of a permanent armaments industry. It was something that had developed during his lifetime. The armaments industry was more ad hoc during World War I and earlier in Ike's military career. But now it was embedded into the fabric of America, and it was warping the economy. It was taking up a lot of financial resources of the government, and it was permanent. And Eisenhower just wanted to issue a warning that if left unchecked, this kind of spending could be potentially damaging to the country. He much more saw success on an individual basis. He, for example, said that the cure for cancer could probably be found by a solitary inventor tinkering alone in his attic, rather than these huge government outlays of expenditures to the defense industry or to universities or corporations. So Eisenhower was very leery about what he was witnessing, and he, especially as a military man, could speak with authority on that issue.
I'm going to take some questions from our audience. Thank you so much for joining us and for asking these questions. Here's one. Why do you think, they're asking the panel, why do you think that Ike didn't speak out at first against McCarthy when he began attacking George Marshall? What inhibited Ike? Will, you talked about this a little bit. Why don't you take this? What inhibited Ike from speaking out in defense of Marshall?
Simple answer: ambition. He wanted the presidency, and he, through his former mentor, he was not just a friend, he was his mentor, the man that made that crucial choice about Ike's career. He threw him under the bus. He had a choice right there. And it was unfortunate, but the people who see him, who kind of stress the smile and the sort of grandfather appearance and that, they got to understand that this man learned some lessons. He learned some lessons from Douglas MacArthur. I called them Machiavellian moments when he learned how you had to wield power. And right at that moment, he did that. And it's unfortunate, but he thought the greater good was to have Ike as president.
Will,
I agree with that. No, I agree with that. I think Lewis is right to stress Ike's ambition. He tried to hide it, but the reality is he was ambitious. He was running for president as the leader of a divided political party. You know, the Republican Party was not united. It had a right wing, what they used to call the old guard. McCarthy was a junior member of it, but he was sort of the star of it also. And Ike felt that he needed the right wing of the Republican Party to rally to him. And he needed the Republican base, the most passionate people on the right, to vote for him. He was afraid that he would get the moderates, he'd get a few independents and maybe even a few Democrats, but he had to consolidate himself as a legitimate Republican. Remember, he'd only declared his political allegiance as a Republican in 1951. He had to show that he had the guts to be a conservative and a hardliner on communism. That's partly what he was signaling in that 1952 episode, where he had an opportunity to criticize McCarthy and to praise Marshall, and he didn't take it. And to this day, it's a disappointment. But he put it behind him and said, "Hey, that's the price of doing business," and he moved on from it. I think people rightly ask that question, and they should.
The Americans elected a president, not a saint.
Yep.
Eisenhower had amazing self-control. I'm remembering that his mother, I'm probably going to garble this quote, but his mother said to him that he who masters his own soul is greater than he who conquereth the city. A bit of scripture along those lines, that nothing was greater than self-control. Now, Ike had a big temper, and it showed. So let me ask you, start with you, Yanek, how did Ike master his temper?
Well, part of it was the discipline that was ingrained in him through his years at West Point and in military service. A very good example of his ability to control himself and his temperament and his whenever he wished to stray into areas that he did not, was his giving up smoking. I mean, as Lou mentioned earlier, he was a 4-pack-a-day smoker, and he gave it up cold turkey. And not only did he give it up, but he actually laid cigarettes around the house as a way to show himself that he could see temptation all around him and resist temptation. So he was an extraordinarily disciplined person. And he carried that discipline not only in his military life, but into his presidency and into his retirement as well. David Eisenhower has a story in his memoir about Eisenhower getting furious at him for neglecting some chores. One of my favorite stories about Eisenhower and discipline comes from William Ewald. William Ewald worked with Eisenhower in Eisenhower's retirement, drafting his memoirs. And Bill Ewald told me that once he and another editor, their hours were 8 to 5. They worked long days. They were expected to work into the evening as well. And once Bill Ewald and an editor walked into Eisenhower's office at 8:02, they were 2 minutes late. And Eisenhower looked at them with his cold blue eyes and he goes, "You boys may work late, but you get up late too." And as typical with Eisenhower, that sentence is more complicated than it seems. If you parse that sentence, he was actually complimenting them a little bit with the first half of that sentence. You boys may work late. He recognized that they sometimes worked till midnight on the memoir, and he appreciated that. But he did not want them ever to show up late again, not even 2 minutes late. And so Bill Ewald and the other editor got the message. They were prompt after that. But that was the kind of discipline that Eisenhower expected of others. And he ran his White House as a very tight ship. He did not like people who jumped channels. It was very organized. He was the first president to have a chief of staff to control the flow of people and paperwork into the Oval Office. And it was one reason why Eisenhower's presidency was so successful. It was a very well organized, disciplined, tightly run operation.
You know, I actually, Eisenhower's grand Susan Eisenhower, who has a good new book about Eisenhower's leadership just out, she has a story that goes to his kind of self-control and human fingertips. She's a teenage girl. Has a horse. Eisenhower has a putting green down at his house at Gettysburg that he loves. Eisenhower, I guess he didn't have the record for the most golf games played as a president. Woodrow Wilson maybe did, but he played over 800 rounds of golf as president. He loved golf. So Susan's horse gets loose and tears up Ike's putting green. And Susan thinks, oh, I am in for it now. But Eisenhower was not happy, but he understood that Susan had beat herself up plenty over this, that she was already going to be in shock and miserable and feel his reproach without him ever saying anything. So he really didn't. He was not unkind with her, even though she had violated a pretty big rule about not taking care of her horse as well as getting his golf course shoot up. Eisenhower had this great sort of sensibility of when you can turn it on and when you can turn it off. Yeah. Hard for the rest of us to do, but Eisenhower really had it.
You know, I just wanted to interject, Evan, since you brought up Gettysburg. If anyone listening tonight wants to really see into the sort of character of Eisenhower and his family, make a trip out to the Eisenhower family house at Gettysburg. You know, it's a time capsule of mid-1950s taste, and you can see Mamie's handiwork everywhere in the colorful tapestries and curtains and so on. But what strikes me about the place is that it's so fundamentally modest. You know, Eisenhower's little office there in Gettysburg is about 6 feet by 8 feet. It has a tiny little bookshelf where he kept a few favorite works and a phone and a small desk. The sunroom was there where they would watch TV. You know, and yet they entertained world leaders. So, you know, Nehru stayed overnight in the house. They had, you know, Churchill came, de Gaulle came. Charles de Gaulle came to visit Eisenhower at Gettysburg, and they toured the Gettysburg battlefield together. I mean, it's a sign of his confidence in himself and his confidence in the American way of life, that he would bring these enormously regal figures to his humble farm and say, "This is who we are. This is America." And I just think it's one of the most, much like the Truman House in Independence, for that matter, the FDR home in Hyde Park, they really tell a lot about the occupants. So go and have a look.
And of course, go and look at the memorial now that it's open, and so you don't have to leave Washington to experience Ike. But yes, that drive out to Gettysburg, what is it, about 90 minutes away from Washington, is really worth it. I always like to think that Ike liked to walk the battlefield at Gettysburg. I like to picture that, of him walking Pickett's charge and taking his measure of what the Confederate troops and the Union troops had to do. He was never in battle himself, but he certainly commanded men who had to go in battle. And he also had to deal with this hard question of sacrificing the lives of his soldiers. We haven't talked that much about his experience in World War II as a supreme commander. Again, he's not a battlefield commander. He's not commanding troops in battle, but he's sending great numbers of troops into battle. How did he deal with the life and death of his own soldiers? Lou?
First, I want to return to your earlier subject about the anger and his control. You pay a price for that. It's called suppression. And Ike began to pay that price at West Point. He began to have stress-related diseases from West Point all through his life. And you mentioned the problems in '56, the operation, a heart attack in that year. And a lot of that was stress-related. And so I think he showed that all throughout his career. Now, he was tremendously touched by the death of soldiers. Unlike Patton had I don't want to call it brutal, but it was brutal view of what war was all about. You kill them before they kill you. And it was just straightforward. We're going into battle and a great number you're going to be killed. I never got over that. And it came out quite clearly in North Africa, and then particularly after the Battle of the Bulge, which I think he felt responsible for the loss of quite a few lives. So he was always touched by that. It was made clear when he gave that famous speech in London after the victory.
You know, any one of you can look on YouTube and watch the interview that Eisenhower did at the Normandy Cemetery with Walter Cronkite 20 years after D-Day. And it's one of the most beautiful and sort of touching and real conversations. And just the two men are seated on a bench at one point. The surf is crashing in the background. The American cemetery in Normandy is absolutely gorgeous. And Eisenhower really speaks from heart about what it meant to command men in battle, to know that young men died under his command, and to know that his own son, and he talked about his own son, was at that time graduating from West Point, and that those men gave their lives so that his son could have a full life. And he understood intimately and personally what those boys, in some cases, had given up so that others could live. And I mean, he never forgot it for a second, I don't believe.
Another question from our viewers, Ike and nuclear policy. Ike gave a speech, 1953, Atoms for Peace. A little counterintuitive when you think about atom bombs today. What did Ike mean by his Atoms for Peace speech, and why didn't that come to more fruition? Yanek, you want to talk about that?
Well, Eisenhower, that was a stunning speech because it was very eloquent, and Eisenhower talked about the cost of the military, about how the cost of bombers can translate to hospitals and schools. So military spending, there are trade-offs, and society can make these trade-offs or it can cut back on military spending. So it was a very curious situation for Eisenhower as a military man to cut back on military spending. He kept it at about 40 billion during his presidency, which was really remarkable. And the Pentagon chafed against these kinds of restrictions, against putting all your eggs inside a nuclear basket. But that was Eisenhower's policy, and it was one of the vehicles by which Eisenhower was able to achieve the balanced budgets and leave the country in good fiscal shape.
I just add to that, Evan, that the context of it is important. Yanek is absolutely right about the larger importance, but it was given right after the death of Stalin. And it was a trial balloon, in a sense, to show that America was thinking about a post-Cold War Soviet Union and maybe the end of the Cold War. And so it was partly a visionary statement about the idea of pooling nuclear resources and providing electricity for the third world and so on. But it was also a test to see, does the other side have an appetite for nuclear sharing or for maybe softening the Cold War? And the answer to that question turned out not really. And the reality, I think, is that Eisenhower himself wasn't sure that he was ready to think about thawing the Cold War. And it was too early in his presidency to take a risk on these unknown successors of Stalin. So he didn't commit himself to the Atoms for Peace message as much as he might have.
Ike had a long marriage to Mamie. Let's talk, we've not really talked about her. How did she, talk to us about that marriage. What kept it together, how Mamie supported Ike for all those many years. Lou, you want to take that?
Yes. I think that Bill mentioned this earlier, that their relationship was damaged, I think, by two things. One was the horrible death of their son, and the other was the experience in Panama, I think, which tended to pull them apart. And in a certain sense, Susan Eisenhower has commented upon this, they never really got back together in the same way. So I think that, and remember, he was gone for a long time, and that weakens a relationship inevitably. And when he returned and decided was changing his career in many ways, I think that they came back together in a more or less formal way, but maybe not the same way that you remember from early in their marriage. So I think it was, and I think there are quite a few marriages that are more formal than informal, that people stay together in part because that's what people do. And in the 1950s, that was the rule. That's what people do. And so I think he took that approach.
You know, I thought that too. I remember reading the file of Dr. Snyder, the White House doctor. And Snyder's a close observer of the marriage of Mamie and Ike. He's worried about Ike's blood pressure. He's worried about his health. And in his diary, it comes from me that Ike and Mamie were closer than maybe we realize. Yes, they bickered. Yes, they fought. Many people, many marriages know that. But when it really mattered, they were close. And there was a kind of unspoken sweetness and closeness between them, born of trial. But I think it was there. But, you know, and I want to end on this. You know, there's an expression, the loneliness of command. Eisenhower had to experience intense loneliness. Think of him the night before D-Day. The only person who could say go or not go, with the lives of thousands of men at risk, the fate of Europe at risk, the fate of the war. He alone had to make that decision. Nobody else was going to make it for him. He had countless moments as president, maybe not quite so stark, but pretty lonely. And he had in him a kind of courage and a kind of strength that we should be grateful for. How lucky we were that Dwight Eisenhower was our leader in war and peace. So I want to thank you all for coming tonight. We've enjoyed talking together here. We've enjoyed answering your questions. We hope that you will go to a memorial. If ever there was an American who deserved a great memorial in Washington, it's Dwight D. Eisenhower. Thank you very much.